The Nexus station floated in the darkness of space like a giant metal flower, with petals stretching in every direction. And it served as the biggest trading hub in 3 star systems, where creatures from dozens of planets came to buy and sell their goods. Among the thousands of shops that lined the busy commercial district, there was one store that everyone knew by name, and that store was called Velarix's Toy Emporium, which was run by a tall, insect-like creature named Velarix, who belonged to a species called the Kethrani. Velarix had been making toys for rich families across 12 different star systems for more than 200 years, and he was very proud of his work and his reputation, and he looked down on anyone who he thought was beneath him. His shop was filled with beautiful mechanical toys that moved and sang and danced, and noble families from faraway planets would travel for weeks just to buy one of his creations for their children. Particular day, the shop was quiet, and Velarix stood behind his counter, cleaning his tools with his 4 long arms, while his compound eyes watched the customers walking past his window. That was when the door opened, and a massive creature walked inside, and Velarix immediately recognized her as a Dracorian, one of the proud reptilian species that stood nearly 3 meters tall, with folded wings on their backs and sharp horns on their heads. The Dracorian mother was named Setha, and she had scales the color of deep emeralds that shimmered under the shop lights, and her eyes were like pools of molten gold that held both strength and sadness. Clutched against her chest was her infant daughter Kira, who was small by Dracorian standards, but still larger than most adult humans, and Kira was crying softly, with tears rolling down her scaled cheeks. In Kira's tiny clawed hands was a small mechanical bird that had once been beautiful, with feathers made of thin metal sheets, painted in bright colors, but now one of its wings hung at an awkward angle, broken and unable to move. Setha approached the counter slowly, her footsteps heavy on the floor, and she lowered herself slightly so she could speak to Velarix at a more comfortable level. She explained in her deep rumbling voice that the mechanical bird had been made by her mother many years ago, and her mother had passed away during the long winter on their homeworld, and this toy was the only thing Kira had left to remember her grandmother. The toy had broken during their long journey to the station when their ship had hit unexpected turbulence, and Kira had been crying ever since because the bird could no longer flap its wings and sing its little song. Velarix picked up the toy with 2 of his hands, while his mandibles clicked together in a sound that might have been amusement or might have been disgust. He turned it over several times, examining every part of it with his many eyes, and then he set it back down on the counter and pushed it towards Setha. "This is old work," Velarix said in his clicking voice that sounded like stones rattling in a metal cup, "and it is primitive construction with no elegance or sophistication." Setha felt her heart sink at his words, but she remained calm and asked if he could please repair it anyway, because it meant so much to her daughter. Velarix made a sound that was clearly laughter, though it was not a kind laugh, and he told her that he did not waste his valuable time on repairs of such inferior quality. "If the child wishes to play with a mechanical bird," he said, "then you should purchase a new one from my collection," and he gestured toward the shelves behind him, where dozens of beautiful toys sat waiting. Setha's golden eyes narrowed, and smoke began to curl from her nostrils, which was a sign that a Dracorian was struggling to control their anger. She explained again that this toy had value, sentimental value that could not be replaced, and she asked if he could not understand what it meant to hold something that connected you to someone you had lost forever. Velarix's antennae twitched with impatience, and he told her that sentiment did not pay his fees, and even if it did, he would not sully his reputation by putting his hands on such crude mechanisms. "Take your broken thing elsewhere," he said, and he turned his back on her to return to cleaning his tools. Little Kira understood enough of what had happened to know that the scary bug creature would not help them, and she began to cry louder, a high-pitched keening sound that echoed through the shop and out into the corridor. Other shoppers stopped to look, and some of them whispered to each other about what was happening, but none of them stepped forward to help. Setha gathered her daughter closer and picked up the broken toy with gentle claws, and she turned to leave the shop with her head held high. High because her pride would not allow her to beg. But inside her chest, her heart ached terribly for her child, who had already lost so much. Outside in the corridor, Setha found a quiet bench and sat down with Kira in her lap, rocking her gently and humming a soft tune from their homeworld, while the infant continued to cry. She did not know what to do next, because Velarix was the most famous toymaker on the station, and if he would not help them, then who would? Across the corridor, sitting on a crate outside a much smaller and much less fancy shop, was a human boy named Danny Carter, who was 12 years old, with messy brown hair that stuck up in different directions, and grease stains on his fingers that never seemed to wash away completely. Danny had been watching everything that happened through the window of the toy shop, and he had seen the way Velarix had treated the Dracorian mother and her baby, and it made him feel angry in a way that was hard to. He knew what it felt like to lose someone you loved, because his own mother had died when he was very young, and he still kept her old watch in his pocket, even though it had stopped working years ago. The shop behind him was called Carter's Fix-It Station, and it belonged to his father Pete, who could repair almost anything that people brought to him, from broken communication devices to malfunctioning environmental suits. Danny had grown up in that shop, learning how to use tools before he learned how to read, and he had fixed hundreds of broken things with his own 2 hands. He looked at the crying Dracorian baby and the sad mother trying to comfort her, and he felt something stir in his chest like a small fire being lit. He stood up from his crate and wiped his hands on his pants and took a deep breath. Then he walked across the corridor toward them, not knowing that this simple decision would change everything. Danny walked slowly across the corridor because he did not want to startle the massive Dracorian mother who could probably crush him with one hand if she thought he was a threat to her child. Setha noticed him approaching, and her protective instincts kicked in immediately, causing her to shift Kira behind her body slightly while her golden eyes studied this small creature walking toward her. Danny stopped at a respectful distance and cleared his throat, and his heart was beating fast in his chest, but he kept his voice steady when he spoke. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, and he had to look up to meet her eyes, because she was so much taller than him, even while sitting down. "I saw what happened in there with the Toymaker, and I think I might be able to help you." Setha tilted her head to the side, a gesture that looked almost bird-like, despite her reptilian appearance, and she examined the human boy with curiosity. Humans were relatively new to the galactic community, having only achieved interstellar travel within the last 100 years or so, and most alien species did not think much of them. They were not particularly strong like the Dracorians, and they did not live for hundreds of years like the Kethrani, and their technology was considered primitive compared to the elder species who had been traveling the stars for millennia. "You are a child," Setha observed, and her voice was not unkind, but it carried the weight of her doubt. What could you possibly do that the renowned Toymaker could not? Danny shrugged his shoulders in that casual way humans often did when they were trying not to make a big deal out of something. "I have been fixing things since I could hold a screwdriver," he told her, "and my dad runs the repair shop right over there, and I have worked with him every day since I was old enough to walk." He pointed across the corridor to Carter's Fix-It Station, which looked very small and very plain compared to the fancy toy shop with its stoop, bright lights, and expensive displays. "I have worked on toys before," Danny continued, "and mechanical birds are actually pretty straightforward once you understand how they work, and I would like to try to fix it if you will let me." Kira peeked around her mother's leg, still holding the broken toy against her chest, and her crying had stopped now as she looked at this strange small creature who was speaking to her mother. Her large amber eyes were red from crying, but there was something like hope beginning to appear in them. Sci-Fi considered the offer carefully, turning it over in her mind like a stone being examined for flaws. She had nothing to lose, because the famous Toymaker had already refused to help, and there was something in the human boy's eyes that reminded her of her own hatchlings when they were determined to prove themselves capable. The sincerity was unmistakable, and Sci-Fi had lived long enough to recognize when someone was being honest with her. "Very well," she said, and she lowered herself further so she was closer to Danny's level. "But I must tell you that I cannot pay very much because we have spent most of our credits on this journey to the station." Danny shook his head quickly and held up his hands. "I do not want payment," he said simply. "I just want to help." Sci-Fi blinked several times because this was not the answer she had expected, and in her experience, most people wanted something in return for their services. But the human boy seemed to mean what he said, and she found herself nodding in agreement. Danny smiled and gestured for them to follow him, and he led them across the corridor to his father's repair shop. The inside of Carter's Fix-It station was nothing like the fancy toy shop, with its polished displays and expensive lighting. Instead, it was filled with workbenches covered in tools and spare parts and half-finished projects, and the air smelled like oil and metal, and the particular scent of hard work. A broad-shouldered man with the same messy brown hair as Danny was bent over a dismantled navigation console, his hands buried deep in its mechanical guts, while he muttered to himself about crossed wires. This was Pete Carter, Danny's father, and he looked up when he heard the door open, and his eyebrows rose nearly to his hairline when he saw the towering Dracorian mother and her child following his son into the shop. "Dad," Danny said in a voice that was confident despite his young age, "I told them I would fix their toy, and I was wondering if that was okay with you." Pete wiped his hands on a rag that was already so dirty it probably made them dirtier, and he assessed the situation with the quick eyes of a man who had learned to read people from many different planets. He looked at the broken toy in the infant's hands, and then at the sadness in the mother's eyes, and then at the determination on his son's face. Carter had taught his son everything he knew about fixing machines, but more importantly, he had tried to teach him about helping people when they needed it. He saw now that those lessons had taken root deep in Danny's heart. "Workbench in the back is yours," Pete said with a nod, "and let me know if you need anything." Danny's smile grew wider, and he thanked his father and then led Sci-Fi and Kira to the back of the shop, where a clean workbench waited. He cleared away some spare parts and set up a bright light and laid out his tools in neat rows the way his father had taught him. Then he held out his hands toward Kira and spoke to her in a gentle voice. "Can I see your bird?" he asked, "and I promise I will be very careful with it." Kira looked up at her mother, who nodded encouragingly, and then she slowly held out the broken toy toward the human boy. Danny took it with both hands, treating it like it was the most precious thing in the universe. Set it down on the workbench under the bright light. He pulled a magnifying lens on an adjustable arm into position and began examining the mechanical bird with careful attention. "See here," he said, and he spoke to Kira while he worked, because he could tell she was curious. "The joint mechanism is still intact, which means the main parts are fine." Kira leaned closer, her earlier tears completely forgotten, as she watched the human boy turn her grandmother's toy this way and that under the bright light. "The connecting rod is what snapped," Danny explained, pointing to a tiny piece of metal inside the wing assembly. "And that is actually good news, because we can make a new one without replacing the whole wing." He looked at Kira and smiled at her. "Would you like to help me?" he asked. Kira's eyes went wide with surprise and excitement, and she looked at her mother again. Sci-Fi found herself smiling for the first time since they had entered that horrible day. "Toy shop," and she nodded her permission. Danny handed Kira a small flashlight and showed her how to hold it, so the light shone exactly where he needed to see. and she took the job very seriously, with her tiny claws holding the light perfectly steady. He began the repair process, pulling out delicate tools and explaining each step as he went, and Kira listened to every word with complete fascination. Setha watched from nearby, and a strange warmth spread through her chest as she observed this scene. The Kethrani Toymaker had dismissed them with contempt and made her daughter cry, but this human child had offered help without asking for anything in return, and was now treating Kira with patience and kindness and respect. She did not know yet that this moment would become a story told across the stars, but she knew in her heart that she would never forget it. Word spread through the station's corridors, faster than fire through dry grass, and it seemed like everyone was talking about what was happening in the small repair shop. A human child was fixing a Dracorian family heirloom that the famous Velorix had refused to touch, and people from all different species wanted to see this for themselves. Within an hour, a crowd had gathered outside Carter's Fix-It station, and curious shoppers pressed their faces against the windows to watch Danny work on the mechanical bird. There were tall, thin beings with blue skin, and short, round creatures covered in fur, and floating jellyfish-like aliens that communicated through pulses of colored light. All of them watched with interest, as the small human boy bent over his workbench, with tools in his hands and concentration on his face. Among the observers was a group of Kethrani merchants who worked in Velorix's business network, and they had come to see what all the commotion was. About when they realized what was happening, their mandibles began clicking with disapproval, and they spoke to each other in their rattling language about how insulting this was. In their view, this human child was making their entire species look bad by attempting work that a Kethrani master had deemed unworthy. They did not consider that perhaps it was Velorix who had made them look bad by refusing to help a crying child. Also watching from the crowd was a Selenari diplomat named Ambassador Lyris, who had skin that glowed softly with inner light and large dark eyes that seemed to see everything. The Selenari were one of the oldest species in the known galaxy, and they were famous for their wisdom and their role as peacemakers between warring civilizations. Ambassador Lyris had been walking through the commercial district on her way to a meeting when the gathering crowd caught her attention, and she had stopped to observe. What she saw intrigued her greatly, because humans were still considered newcomers to the galactic community, and many elder species dismissed them as unimportant. But this boy, working patiently on a broken toy while explaining each step to a fascinated Dracorian infant, this was something worth watching. Inside the shop, Danny tried his best to ignore the growing crowd outside and focus on the task in front of him. He had fabricated a new connecting rod from spare materials, carefully measuring and cutting and shaping the metal until it matched the broken piece exactly. Now he was attaching it to the wing assembly, and this was the delicate part that required steady hands and complete concentration. Almost done, he told Kira, who had been an excellent assistant throughout the whole process. I just need to calibrate the movement so this wing moves exactly like the other one. Kira watched with her amber eyes wide open, and she had stopped being sad a long time ago, because watching Danny work was the most interesting thing she had ever seen. She had never known that fixing things could be so fascinating, and she had never met anyone who explained everything so patiently and made her feel like she was helping, even though she was just a baby. Pete Carter had noticed the crowd outside, and his expression grew serious as he moved to stand near his son. He did not interfere with Danny's work, because he trusted his son's abilities completely, but he wanted to be close by in case trouble arrived. Living on a space station for 15 years had taught Pete that attention could be a blessing or a curse, depending on who was paying attention. The Kethrani merchants decided that watching was not enough, and they pushed through the crowd and entered the shop with their long legs clicking on the floor. The largest one approached Pete with his compound eyes glittering in a way that was clearly meant to be intimidating. "Human," the Kethrani said in his rattling voice, "your offspring oversteps his place, and toy repair is the domain of licensed craftsmen, and this is unauthorized work." Pete crossed his arms over his chest and looked at the Kethrani without any fear in his eyes. "Show me the regulation that says a person cannot fix a family heirloom for free," Pete replied calmly. The Kethrani hesitated because there was no such regulation, and he knew it. And he had been hoping that the human would be intimidated enough to stop without questioning him. But Pete Carter had not survived 15 years on a diverse space station by being easily frightened, and he had dealt with bullies of all species before. The other Kethrani merchants shifted nervously because this was not going the way they had planned, and the crowd outside was watching everything through the windows. That was when Ambassador Lyris entered the shop, and her presence immediately changed the atmosphere like a cool breeze. Flowing through a hot room, the Kethrani stepped back respectfully, because everyone knew that challenging a Selenari diplomat without good reason could have serious consequences for one's reputation and business. "I believe," Ambassador Lyris said in her voice that sounded like music and flowing water combined, "that we are all curious to see the result of this young human's efforts, and perhaps we should allow him to finish his work in peace." It was not phrased as a command, but everyone understood that it was not a suggestion either. The Kethrani merchants retreated to the edge of the room, still clicking with displeasure, but no longer willing to interfere. Danny, who had been trying very hard to ignore all the commotion behind him, made the final adjustment to the mechanical bird's wing mechanism. He picked up the small key that wound the toy's internal mechanism and turned it slowly several times until he felt the resistance that told him it was fully wound. Then he set the bird down on the workbench and held his breath. For a moment nothing happened, and Danny felt his heart beating so hard he thought everyone in the shop must be able to hear it. Then the mechanical bird's wings began to move, both of them together in perfect harmony, flapping up and down just as they were meant to. The bird hopped forward on its tiny metal feet and opened its beak, and a beautiful little song came out, a melody that had not been heard since Kira's grandmother had wound it for the last time. Kira let out a sound that was half squeal and half laugh, pure joy exploding from her small body, and she reached for her beloved toy with both hands. Danny picked up the bird gently and placed it in her claws, and she hugged it against her chest while tears of happiness rolled down her scaled cheeks. Then she did something that surprised everyone in the room. She threw her small arms around Danny's neck and hugged him tight. And she said something in Dracorian that he did not understand, but the meaning was perfectly clear. The crowd outside erupted in applause, and even some of the Kethrani merchants found themselves clicking in what might have been reluctant approval. Ambassador Lyris smiled, and the glow of her skin seemed to brighten just a little bit. Setha stood frozen for a moment, overwhelmed by emotion, and then she moved forward and placed her large clawed hand on Danny's shoulder with a gentleness that seemed impossible for such a powerful creature. "You have given my daughter back her connection to her grandmother," Setha said, and her voice trembled with feeling, "and I do not have words big enough to thank you." Danny's face turned red with embarrassment, because he was not used to being the center of so much attention. "It was just a broken wing," he said quietly, "and anyone could have fixed it." But that was not true, and everyone in the room knew it. The applause continued for a long time, and creatures of all different species pressed forward to get a better look at the human boy who had done what the famous Toymaker refused to do. Ambassador Lyris moved through the crowd with grace, her glowing skin casting soft light on the faces around her, and she approached Danny with genuine interest in her large dark eyes. "You have shown great skill today," she told him, "but more importantly, you have shown great kindness, and that is a quality that cannot be taught." Danny did not know how to respond to such praise from such an important person, so he just nodded and tried not to look as nervous as he felt. Setha rose to her full impressive height, towering over everyone in the shop, except for a few of the taller alien species, and her golden eyes were glistening with tears she was too proud to let fall. "You have done what the proud Toymaker would not," she announced in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "You have restored my mother's gift to my daughter, and this is a debt that cannot be measured in credits." The Kathrani merchants in the corner shifted uncomfortably, because they knew that word of what happened today would spread quickly through the station's communication networks. Within hours, everyone would know that Velarix had turned away a grieving mother and her crying infant, and that a human child had stepped in to help when no one else would. This was exactly what happened. By the time the station's artificial lights began to dim to simulate evening, the story had traveled to every sector and every level of Nexus Station. People talked about it in restaurants and bars, in shops and offices, in the corridors and the docking bays where ships arrived and departed. The noble families who were Velarix's most important customers heard the story too, and they were not happy about it. The Dracorians were respected throughout the galaxy as honorable traitors and fierce warriors, and the dismissive treatment of a Dracorian mother and her infant reflected poorly on anyone connected to it. Even more damaging was the contrast that the story created. A child from a species that most aliens considered primitive and unimportant had demonstrated skill and compassion and professionalism that the renowned Kathrani master had failed to show. Velarix found his shop empty of customers the next morning, and the morning after that, and the morning after that. His communication device, which had always been full of orders from wealthy families, fell silent. The following week, Velarix swallowed his pride and walked across the commercial district to Carter's Fix-It station, which had become famous overnight. He stood in the doorway, with his compound eyes taking in the modest shop that had somehow embarrassed him more than any competitor ever had. Pete Carter looked up from the engine component he was repairing, and regarded the Kathrani Toymaker with an expression that was neutral but not friendly. "Can I help you?" Pete asked. Velarix's mandibles clicked nervously, a sound that his species made when they were uncomfortable, and he asked if he could speak with the boy. Danny emerged from the back room, where he had been organizing spare parts, and he wiped his hands on a rag, just like his father always did. He looked at Velarix without any anger on his face, but also without the admiration and respect that the Toymaker was used to receiving from those he considered beneath him. "I have come to apologize," Velarix said, and the words clearly caused him pain to speak, "because my behavior was inappropriate, and I allowed my pride to override my duty as a craftsman." Danny listened quietly, and then nodded once. "Okay," he said simply. Velarix had expected more of a reaction, perhaps gratitude for the apology, or questions about why he had acted the way he did. The human boy just stood there, waiting. The Toymaker continued with the second part of his visit, which was actually the main reason he had come. "I also wish to offer you an apprenticeship," Velarix said, and his antennae twitched with what might have been hope, "because your skill is evident to anyone with eyes to see, and under my guidance, you could become a master craftsman recognized throughout the galaxy." This offer hung in the air like smoke, and everyone in the shop understood how significant it was. No Kathrani master had ever offered an apprenticeship to an alien before, and certainly never to a human. And this was the kind of opportunity that most people would accept without hesitation. Danny looked at his father, who stood silently by his workbench with his arms crossed, letting his son make his own decision. Then Danny looked back at Velarix, and when he spoke, his voice was polite but firm. "Thank you for the offer," Danny said. "But I already have a teacher." He glanced at his father with obvious love and respect in his eyes. "And besides," Danny continued, "I do not think I would fit in at a place that turns away crying children." The words were not spoken with cruelty or anger, but they landed like stones dropping into still water, creating ripples that spread outward in all directions. Velarix's antenna drooped slightly because he had not expected to be rejected, and perhaps for the first time in his long life, he understood that reputation was not built only on skill. It was also built on how you treated people who could do nothing for you. "I understand," Velarix said finally, "and perhaps in time you will reconsider." He turned and left the shop without another word, his pride wounded, but also something else stirring in his chest that might have been the beginning of real change. Ambassador Lyris, who had been standing quietly in the corner, observing everything, stepped forward after Velarix departed. "That was well done," she told Danny, "because you spoke truth without cruelty, and that is a difficult balance to achieve." She reached into her flowing robes and withdrew a small crystal that pulsed with inner light. "This is my personal communication crystal," she said as she placed it in Danny's hand, "and if you ever need assistance, or find yourself in trouble, you may use it to contact me directly." Danny stared at the crystal with wide eyes, because he understood what an incredible gift this was. Selenari diplomats were among the most powerful and respected beings in the galaxy, and having a direct line to one of them was something that wealthy nobles would pay fortunes for. "Thank you," Danny managed to say, though his voice came out barely above a whisper. Ambassador Lyris smiled, and her glowing skin pulsed with warmth. "Thank you," she replied, "for reminding me why the younger species give me hope for the future." Then, leaving the Carters alone in their shop, and Pete walked over to his son and put a hand on his shoulder. "I am proud of you," Pete said simply. Danny looked up at his father and smiled, and for that moment nothing else in the universe mattered. But outside the shop, the story continued to spread, traveling on ships to distant star systems, and it was only the beginning of something much bigger than any of them could have imagined. 6 months passed like water flowing through a river, and Carter's Fix-It station was no longer the small, modest shop it had once been. The business had expanded into the 2 empty storefronts on either side, knocking down walls to create a larger workspace that could handle the flood of customers who came from all across the station and beyond. Pete Carter had hired new workers to help with the growing demand, and the staff now included technicians from 7 different species who worked side by side at their benches. Was a young Kathrani named Vex, who had left Velarix's shop after hearing the story, and a Dracorian engineer named Korath, who had traveled from Setha's homeworld specifically to work alongside the humans. There was also a pair of twin mechanics from a species called the Malori, who communicated through musical whistles, and a gruff 4-armed Torvax named Grunt, who had the gentlest touch with delicate machinery, despite his intimidating appearance. Danny had trained every single one of them, and he had taught them what he called the most important rule of Carter's Fix-It station: never turn away someone in need. This rule was painted on a sign above the main entrance, and it was the first thing every customer saw when they walked through the door. Setha had returned to her homeworld after her visit to Nexus Station, but she had not forgotten the human boy who had helped her daughter. She had shared the story with her entire clan, telling it around fires during the long winter nights, and the tale had spread from there to other clans and other continents, until every Dracorian knew the name Danny Carter. Now Dracorian merchants preferentially used Carter's services whenever they passed through Nexus Station, and they told everyone they met about the human repair shop where kindness mattered more than profit. The relationship between the Carter family and Setha's clan had become a bond of honor that would last for generations, sealed not with contracts or credits, but with the simple memory of a boy who had fixed a broken toy. Ambassador Lyris had submitted a detailed report to the Selenari Council about the incident, using it as evidence to support her argument that the younger species should not be underestimated or dismissed. Humans, she wrote, possess a quality that many of the elder species seem to have lost somewhere in their long histories. She called this quality compassion without calculation, meant the willingness to help others simply because helping was the right thing to do, without expecting reward or recognition. The report had been read by important beings throughout the galaxy, and it had changed the way many of them thought about humanity. Danny himself continued to work alongside his father every day, learning new techniques and teaching others what he knew. He had grown 2 inches taller in the past 6 months, and his voice had started to change, but he was still the same person who had walked across a corridor to help a crying child. One thing had changed, though, and it was something that made Pete Carter smile every time he saw it. Danny never charged for repairs on children's toys. Not ever, not for anyone, no matter how much they offered to pay. This had become the most famous tradition of Carter's Fix-It Station, and parents from dozens of species brought their children's broken treasures to the shop, knowing that they would be fixed with care and returned with smiles. One evening, as the station's lights dimmed to simulate the coming of night, Pete and Danny sat together on a bench in the corridor outside their shop. The commercial district was quieter now, as shops closed and workers headed home to their quarters, and the two Carters watched the last few customers walking past. "You know," Pete said in a thoughtful voice, "what you did 6 months ago changed things in ways I never expected." Danny looked at his father with curiosity, waiting for him to continue. "Not just for us," Pete went on, "though business has certainly gotten better, but for how people out here see humans." He gestured at the corridor around them, at the diverse collection of species that called Nexus Station home. "Most of them used to look at us like we were barely worth noticing," Pete said. "Just another young species stumbling around the galaxy, trying to figure things out. Now they tell stories about a human boy who helped a Dracorian child when no one else would," Pete replied. "And those stories have traveled to places we will never go, and they have changed minds we will never meet." Danny felt uncomfortable with this kind of talk, because he did not like being treated like he was special. "I just fixed a toy, Dad," he said quietly. "It was not that big a deal." Pete put his arm around his son's shoulders and pulled him close. "No," Pete said firmly, "you showed them who we are." He paused for a moment, looking up at the stars visible through the station's transparent ceiling. "Not our technology," Pete continued, "because plenty of species have better technology than us, and not our military, because we are not the strongest fighters in the galaxy, and not our economy, because we are far from the wealthiest." "Then what?" Danny asked. Pete looked at his son with pride shining in his eyes. "Simply, you showed them our heart. Across the galaxy, in ships and stations, and on planets orbiting distant stars, the story continued to spread and grow and change. Different species told it in different ways, adding their own details and interpretations, but the core remained the same, no matter who was telling it. When the mighty and the proud had turned away, a human child had stepped forward. Not for glory, not for payment, not for reputation or advancement, but because a little girl was crying and her toy was broken, and he knew how to help. Some of the storytellers said it was a perfect example of human foolishness, wasting time and skill on something that would bring no benefit. But most of them said something different. Most of them said it was a perfect example of human strength, the strange and wonderful quality that made this young species worth watching. That, the storytellers concluded, with voices and clicks and whistles and songs, was the story of a child who had shown them our heart, was humanity. And perhaps, they added as their listeners leaned closer to hear, that was enough. Years later, when Danny Carter had grown into a man with his own shop and his own family and his own stories to tell, he would still remember that day. He would remember the crying Dracorian child, and the broken mechanical bird, and the arrogant Toymaker who had refused to help. And he would remember walking across that corridor without knowing what would happen next, knowing only that someone needed help, and he could provide it. That memory would stay with him forever, a reminder of the moment when everything changed, not because he had done something extraordinary, but because he had done something ordinary that happened to be exactly right. And when his own children asked him what it meant to be human, that was the story he would tell.